Welcome to our workshop on the Developmental Continua of Oracy Skills. This is part 2 of our two-part series of Oracy in the ELA classroom. My name is Melinda Clifford. I'm the coordinator for the elementary and secondary ELA programs at the Ministry of Education, and I am accompanied today by my wonderful colleague, Dawn.
I'm Dawn Uniad. I'm a teacher from the Sir Wilfrid Laurier School Board, currently on a loan of service working with Melinda on the ELA team.
Thank you. We're going to start today with a very short clip of what classroom talk can look like. We'll ask you to pause this recording and view a video that you can access by scanning the QR code on your screen or by entering the URL in your browser. So have small group discussions ever looked like this in your classroom? Hopefully rarely, but we've no doubt all experienced situations where we've set up small group discussions only to have students who were not on task, not listening to each other, talking over the top of one another, or generally showing a lack of respect for others in the group. And we have to wonder if students like these have ever been taught the necessary skills they need to engage in academic conversations. In part 1 of our Oracy workshop series, we looked at the Oracy skills that we need to teach students explicitly. And today, in part 2, we're going to look at the two tools that describe what the skills look like in action at different levels. In today's session, we'll be presenting the Developmental Continua of Oracy Skills. We'll provide you with a brief background as to how the tools came into being and how they relate to the Rse Skills Tool. We'll take an in-depth look at how the teacher continuum works for planning instruction and providing feedback. And then we'll look at the student continuum and how students can use it to reflect on their own Oracy development, set goals, and develop strategies to move forward. Educator and researcher James Britton wrote that reading and writing float on a sea of talk, and it's an apt metaphor for how talk works in our ELA programs. Yet our research showed that teachers really have very little support and resources when it comes to teaching talk. In the fall of 2020, we surveyed ELA teachers across the province to determine the state of talk in our English schools in Quebec. We asked teachers what would most help them teach and assess talk. And as you can see from the results on the slide, more than 80% of respondents chose formative assessment tools as their top choice to both better teach and assess talk. With the help of the subcommittee of the PACT, that's the Provincial Advisory Council for Teachers of English, we began work on the creation of a suite of Oracy tools. The first of which, the Rse Skills Tool, which you can see on your screen, illustrates what to teach, and that's based on all 3 of our ELA programs. This tool is essentially the foundation which supports both the Oracy Continua, but this tool on its own isn't enough. So we wanted to create something that would help teachers and students see what these skills look like in action in the classroom. Teachers wanted to be able to assess where their students were in their Oracy development, and they needed a tool that would help them plan the next steps to move students forward. And to describe those, I'm going to pass it over to Dawn.
Thank you, Melinda. The Oracy Continua that we're presenting to you today were created to address the issues that Melinda just mentioned. How do we assess our students' Oracy development and plan instruction to move them forward? And before we take a look at the Continua, there is something important that we need to clarify, and that's the question, how is a continuum different from a rubric? So here's a quick little video to help answer the question.
How is a continuum different from a rubric? A continuum is a tool for planning teaching. A rubric is a tool for evaluating student performance. A continuum describes a developmental progression. A rubric describes levels of achievement. A continuum informs teachers about what they can expect regarding student development. A rubric is used to identify evaluation criteria. A continuum is used to plan teaching. A rubric is used to evaluate student performance on a complex task. A continuum is not tied to grade or cycle level expectations. A rubric is tied to criteria specific to a grade level or cycle. A continuum is used to inform subsequent teaching. A rubric can be used to inform subsequent teaching. To summarize, a continuum describes developmental progression, is used to plan and inform teaching, is not tied to grade or cycle level expectations.
So I hope that helped to differentiate between the two kinds of tools. And I think as we look at the continua, that will also help to illustrate the difference between a rubric and a continuum. So we're going to present to you two developmental continua. One is designed to help teachers situate students in order to plan instruction and provide feedback. The other is designed to help students reflect on their learning and set goals. And they were modeled on the Reader Response Learning Continuum that's available on Literacy Today, just like all of the tools that we're showing you today. You may already be familiar with that one, with the response continuum, and you'll see there are a lot of similarities. So these continua reflect a developmental view of Oracy from elementary school through secondary school and beyond. They describe a learner's progression in Oracy over time. And it's important to note that a learner might be at different places on a continuum at one point in time, based on the complexity of the task, the learning context, and the nature of the supports being offered. For example, a student might be very self-confident and articulate when in conversation with a friend, but in a whole class discussion, that student might be very shy and have trouble expressing their thoughts. You'll notice that the color-coded strands carry over from the Oracy Skills Tool. The Oracy Skills Tool describes what to teach, while the continua describe the skills in action. The continua were field tested in elementary and secondary classrooms last year and also validated by Bishop's University. So we'll take a look at each of the continua one at a time. Here is the developmental continuum for planning instruction and providing feedback. And please remember, it's not a rubric. So the focus is on improving learning and moving students forward. It's not about grades. And we know that teachers need to have marks, but with these continua, we're working on helping students learn and progress and improve their Oracy skills so that when it's time to evaluate students, maybe on a complex task with a rubric attached, students will be prepared to do their best. So we might say the continua focus on the foundation and building blocks, whereas a rubric would evaluate the whole completed building. The top of the continuum shows the 4 strands from the Oracy Skills Tool, so physical, linguistic, cognitive, and social and emotional. Terms in bold are defined in the glossary of Oracy terms. And if we look at the linguistic strand, you'll notice that stylistic features and rhetorical strategies are in bold font, and the glossary will give us definitions for these terms, just like this. And you'll find that the glossary is part of the Oracy Toolkit available on Literacy Today. We read the continua from bottom to top. So at the very bottom, we have this information. Most of this I've already mentioned. The continuum shows the development of skills that are spelled out in the Oracy Skills Tool. We see descriptors of Oracy skills in action, but this is not an exhaustive list. It just gives some examples. The levels build upon each other. So at higher levels, you can assume that students have already mastered skills in the lower levels, and you know how the glossary works. Lastly, some important advice: to develop Oracy skills, students need explicit instruction, scaffolding, and practice in a variety of contexts. So let's look at the levels. Starting at the bottom, we see before beginning. There are no descriptors here, but we need to recognize that students may not yet appear on the continuum, and they're working towards what is indicated at the beginning level. Then as we move up, we have the developing level, the consolidating level, and finally the extending level. And if you've worked with the Reader Response Learning Continuum, you'll see a lot of similarities, like reading from bottom to top, the 4 columns, and this was intentional so that these new tools would not be completely unfamiliar. At each level, we have descriptors for the 4 strands. If we zoom in, you can see, for example, in the physical strand, we might observe a student at the consolidating level in a specific situation. For example, a small group discussion like a literature circle or maybe in a debate. And in that context, we might see that the student is varying, adapting, and controlling their voice and body language in light of the context, their purpose, and the audience. So as you see, students at the consolidating level are doing very well. But for more of a challenge to move them to the extending level, A teacher could plan instruction and give students feedback to help them master their use of voice and body language and deliberately connect with the audience to make an impact. Let's see how we can use the continuum to situate a learner. At this point, you might want to open a copy of the Teacher Continuum, which you can download from the Literacy Today website. If you download or print a copy, you can refer to it as we view the video. And we're going to watch a small group of students discuss a text. Pay attention to the boy in the white shirt, and let's see if we can connect our observations of him to the descriptors on the continuum. And it will probably be easiest if you focus just on the cognitive and social and emotional strands. So now we are going to go ahead and view the video, and we invite you to note your observations.
Yeah.
Was this one where he's talking about the community.
Right.
Yeah. And so he's talking about the circle. So on the inside, in the middle, were the children.
Right.
Then the elders who would teach them, and then the mothers.
Yeah.
They're the givers, so they basically produce everything. Mm-hmm. And then on the outside, we have the warriors, and the warriors were the men that were protected everything inside the circle.
Okay.
So
okay.
one thing that Juliana actually just noticed
What?
was outside of his pupil, that's the outside circle where the warriors are protected.
And oh, that makes so much sense.
Right?
Okay, I get it.
That's
I get
quite
it.
interesting.
Yeah, like the title, right?
Right, the title.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, okay.
What meaning do you think the title has?
Well, it's basically him being on the outside circle, right? Because he's a
What
warrior.
does that mean? But he's not on the outside of the circle on the cover page. That doesn't make any sense.
Spirit bear.
Right. But the spirit bear is on the outside. But why is he on the inside? Do you think it could be because he needs protecting?
He needs protecting. He's
Okay,
still
that makes
vulnerable
sense.
at this time.
Yeah, the state in the book when he was like in jail and everything, he was like broken.
Like the
that
bear
makes
is
sense, that
going
makes sense.
outside the circle.
Right. Well, why do you think his arm is bleeding? Do you know?
Well, that's from his tattoo, remember?
From his tattoo, but why? It's either he's a really bad tattoo artist or there's like some meaning that we don't understand, guys.
It's almost like everything that has plagued the natives for such a long time is now his burden, stuff that he has to worry about now. So we can see here, like, 1867 Indian Act.
And that's like tattooed on, right?
Exactly.
We could see that it's not like really tattooed on him,
No, it's not really tattooed
but like
on.
it's sort of like
It's
a burden he has to
figurative.
hold over
Exactly.
himself, right?
Exactly.
Okay. It seems like that they're all wearing a mask, right? What does the mask represent? Like, I don't get it.
I always thought because it's always when he got angry that he started like wearing the mask, and you see like he's crying blood. So I always feel like it's about his anger, and it always pops up when he has like anger or whatever.
So we're going to stop right there. And let's see if we can situate the student in the white shirt on the continuum. For the physical strand, I don't think there's anything special to note here. Same for the linguistic strand. And it's not necessary to examine all of the strands all the time. And it's just not practical, especially when you're just beginning to work with the tool and trying to become familiar with it. So if we look at the social and emotional strand at the developing level, I'd say our student has this covered. He follows social conventions for the most part, demonstrates listening with his verbal and nonverbal responses, builds confidence by contributing. And if we move up to consolidating, this looks like the best fit for him. He listens actively and responds to the ideas of others, and he contributes in an assured manner through positive interactions. In this context, in this clip, I'm not sure about reading an audience and adapting. We don't really have evidence, so we can't make a judgment on that, but that's okay. And if we look at the cognitive, let's start at the beginning level. It looks like he seems to have more than an emerging awareness of audience and purpose, and he adjusts thinking and organizes ideas. We see this when he listens, asks follow-up questions, and uses new information to move the discussion forward. So let's look at the developing level. And this looks like a good match. He expresses ideas, uses strategies like questioning and clarifying. Again, reading the audience, we can't really say based on this short clip. And you've probably noticed that there is a certain amount of overlap. For example, we've seen references to the audience in both the cognitive and social and emotional strands. And in the linguistic and physical strands, we'll see references to audience there too. So keep in mind that although all the skills and descriptors are in nice little boxes on the continua, in reality, they can overlap. And sometimes it's more important to recognize what students are doing and help them to move forward than it is to identify precisely which strand they're working on. So now that we've situated our student, we might want to plan some specific instruction or give him some feedback. And I think I'd focus on the cognitive strand and see if we can move him forward from developing to the consolidating level. I think he's pretty good with acknowledging and considering different perspectives, but maybe he could work on purposefully choosing strategies to take the discussion further and expanding his ideas. And remember that we're doing this as an exercise. In your classroom, you know your students, and you'd be in a better position to understand what's going on. Something we wondered about was this student trying to encourage others to participate, and that's why he didn't contribute a lot of new ideas himself. Maybe what we saw is not typical, and he would generally fall more into the experience level. And something else to keep in mind, this video was not made to illustrate talk skills per se. It was created to show students discussing crafting choices as part of their response to literature. And it's evident that their teacher did an excellent job with them. And this video, along with other great examples of classroom practice, can be found on the Literacy Today website. So let's think back to what we observed in the video and look at an example of what we might do to move our student forward. So we'll start with the descriptors of the cognitive strand at the developing level and where we situated our student. And then we'll look at the consolidating level, what we're working towards. And we could try talk moves as a strategy. These are from the talk section of Literacy Today. With our student, we could look at these talk moves and discuss how and when they might be used, model and practice. We could brainstorm some additions or variations to the sentence stems and post them on the wall or project them on the interactive whiteboard, or we could make cards and tape them to the desk or tabletop, and all of this can help our student to incorporate these talk moves into his discussion repertoire. Keep in mind that it's okay to focus on just a small part of the continuum on what your students need, and that might be just one small part of a strand. For example, in the social and emotional strand, you might have a student who understands social conventions for talk and who is a really good listener, but who needs help to build self-confidence. So that could be your focus for planning instruction and providing feedback. And especially for our students with special needs, we need to find something that they can work towards and be successful. And it could be something very specific, like using an appropriate level of volume, or maybe it's teaching specific vocabulary. We don't want you or your students to be overwhelmed by this. Just take manageable pieces, meet your students where they are, and go one step at a time. And we know that continua contain a lot of text, a lot of information, so it's okay to approach it a little at a time. Like the Rse Skills Tool, you don't have to teach everything at once. Start with what makes sense for you and your students. And teachers have told us that often they can work Oracy skills into what they're already doing. So it's not more to teach, maybe just a slightly different approach. For example, when you're doing a think, pair, share activity, you might take a minute to make sure students know how to show their partners that they are listening and review what active listening looks like and sounds like. And we're going to pause here for a few minutes and think about what we've just looked at. What are your first impressions of the teacher continuum? The developmental continuum of Oracy skills for planning instruction and providing feedback. And think about how you can see yourself using this continuum. And then when you're ready, you can move on to the next section.
Thanks, Dawn. You may be familiar with John Hattie's groundbreaking study, Visible Learning, in which he ranked hundreds of influences and their direct impact on learning outcomes. Feedback was ranked as one of the top 10 influences on student learning. So why formative assessment? Because assessments used formatively shape feedback and instruction as the teacher determines what needs to be taught next in the face of what has been and what has not yet been learned. Feedback drives learning as the student utilizes the feedback to improve performance. Feedback essentially is the connective tissue in the assessment system. So a quick word on feedback. There are three main types of feedback. The first and most popular is often generic praise. For example, wow, great job, which is really nice for students to hear, but on its own, it's not very useful in the learning process. There's also corrective feedback, which can be useful if it's given as the child is learning and when the child can immediately have an opportunity to correct. But it doesn't provide any additional information as to how the student can improve or what process they can adopt to move forward. High information feedback combines corrective feedback with information about the process, as well as self-regulation, and it can help learners answer 3 main questions. Where am I going? How am I going there? And where will I go next? We're going to ask you to watch another video of students in an elementary class science lesson. They're discussing the question, do very small things have weight? This teacher's also been working with talk moves to facilitate conversation and promote student interaction. You can access the video by scanning the QR code or using the link at the bottom of the slide. Once you've watched the video, we'll discuss how the Oracy Continuum could help this teacher provide feedback to the students and also help plan the next steps for her instruction. So the video we just watched shows students using talk to fuel their learning in a science class. The Developmental Continuum of Oracy Skills could help Joan set a destination for her students. As they use language to communicate and to learn, Joan can see that her students are developing their Oracy skills as they use science-related vocabulary, for example, as well as a variety of talk moves to participate in their group discussion. But how can she move them forward in their Oracy development? Let's say, for example, that Joan would like her students to use more extensive vocabulary and also to begin to analyze what they're reading and viewing in class to be able to select and organize that information to fuel a discussion. So to do this, she may highlight some of the new words that appear in the texts that they're reading and viewing and encourage them to use those new words when they're talking about the mass of things. Cognitively, she'd like her students to begin to analyze, select, and organize information from experiments and related texts to support their opinions in their small and whole class discussions. To do this, she may encourage her students to refer back to the images, charts, videos, or any other texts that they will have used that provide information to support their ideas and opinions. Perhaps there are charts or diagrams posted on the walls, or maybe they have a science journal that they can refer to during their discussions. So if these are Joan's goals for talk, then feedback to her students could look something like this. So I noticed a lot of you were doing a great job using talk moves to contribute your ideas. I heard things like, I agree with, or maybe such and such will change their mind because, or I'm going to refer back to the question and adding on to what such and such said. This really helped us share our ideas and what we understand about the massive things. I also noticed that many of you were supporting your ideas with examples by referring to different objects. For example, the copper cube, the pine cube, a feather, clay. I'm going to ask you to read a text, look at a chart, or watch a short video on mass. When we come back to share this information, we can use our talk moves to help us support our ideas. Can someone remind us what some of these talk moves look and sound like when we want somebody to support our ideas with evidence? How will you remember the information that you want to share to support your ideas? What are some of the strategies that you could use to help you select and organize your information? And remember to write down any new vocabulary words so that we can discuss them next time. To move her students forward from developing to consolidating in the cognitive strand, Joan could use talk moves like these to help her students support and challenge ideas. Questions like, for example, is a good one to start with to support an idea, or in the text it says, I wonder if, and questions like, what makes that a good example, or can you give me an example, encourages students to defend their opinions and back them up with evidence. So where will I go next? This is an opportunity for teachers to shift the focus back to the students' future actions. Self-evaluation, reflection, and goal setting have significantly positive effects on student learning outcomes, which is why we also decided to develop a version of the Oracy Continuum for students. So how can students use this continuum to reflect and to set goals? The Student Continuum of Oracy Skills is for reflection and goal setting, and it takes the metacognitive strand from the Rse Skills Tool and places it at the very top as an overarching or umbrella strand. So you can see the use of the I pronoun translates the skills into action statements. So I am developing as a learner and a thinker. I reflect on myself as a communicator. I use my understanding of Oracy to grow as a communicator and a learner, and I recognize the value of my own contributions and their impact. So as you can see, the strands and the skills remain the same as those in the Rse Skills Tool and the same as those in the Teacher Continuum too. So let's say that student X uses the Continuum to assess their Oracy development. They can use strategies like questioning and summarizing and sometimes build on the ideas of others. So they see themselves as developing on these cognitive skills. But their goal is to reach a more experienced level where they can support their ideas and opinions with pertinent information and consider different perspectives. So to make this continuum really accessible to students, we created an interactive goal-setting tool that they can easily fill out. They simply choose the section that they wish to focus on. So let's say in this case, it's the cognitive strand. There's a place for them to write their goal, and then they can choose a strategy that they can use to try and achieve their goal. So for example, let's say student X would like to build more on the ideas of others. The strategy that they plan to use is to practice using talk moves like, I would add that, or I'd like to say more about, or in addition to. And there are checkboxes at the top that they can click on to indicate if they've attained the goal or if more practice is required. This can be a really good tool to use in teacher-student conferences and to get students thinking about their own Oracy development and setting goals for themselves in how they communicate. So we know that it looks like a lot to take in, but I will echo what Dawn said earlier on. Just a reminder that students don't have to focus on the whole thing. They can choose to focus on just one skill at a time if they wish. The student continuum is easily recognizable with the turquoise metacognitive strand at the very top. And you can see that it uses the same color-coded strands and the glossary as the other tools, but it's distinguished by I statements to better help students see themselves as they use the skills in action. So we're going to pause here for a few minutes to think about what we've just looked at. What are your first impressions of the teacher continuum and the student continuum? And do you think the planning tool is helpful? Resources and links to the videos that we watched in this webinar are available here. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to contact us at admin@literacytoday.ca. Thanks for joining us.